Welcome back. In part 1 of chapter 22, we saw the United States reeling from the blow of a financial crash and later struggling to find its way as the darkness of the Great Depression descended upon not only the nation, but the rest of the world. Traditional ways of thinking about capitalism were proving incapable of dealing with the economic task at hand. In the midst of its despair, the United States turned to a new national leader who proclaimed a New Deal for all Americans, even though he technically didn't really explain what that entailed. It was left up to this man, ironically, who was confined in a wheelchair, to get the nation back on its financial feet, and who, upon assuming power, declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." So once again, ladies and gentlemen, join me as I serve as your escort as I navigate you through the thickets of U.S. history as we talk about Part 2, Chapter 22, Depression, Dissent, and the New Deal. Let's talk about the first 100 days, the first New Deal. What we saw in the world is the Depression didn't provide a single unified pattern of international response. Different nations were doing different things. And in Great Britain and France, conservative governments were elected, and they were more concerned about maintaining the status quo than actually tackling the Great Depression itself. In Germany, Adolf Hitler becomes chancellor and later Führer of the nation and sets about setting up his dictatorship of Germany. Eventually, he'll put Germany on a war footing, which will pull Germany out of the Great Depression. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin is launched into the first of a series of 5-year plans in which he plans to yank the Soviet Union into the 20th century by large-scale industrialization. The human cost will be in millions of lives. In Japan, the Japanese militarists are now taken upon invading China to expand their role in Asia. So what we're seeing is, with this depression, is starting to come the seeds of the Second World War, and we'll get into that in the next chapter. So for FDR, he sees the New Deal as kind of an alternative between the extreme left of the political spectrum, communism, and the extreme right, fascism. And as he takes power, FDR is looking to a group of intellectuals and social workers to help formulate what this New Deal will be. Because, again, FDR doesn't really specify during the campaign what exactly the New Deal is. So he's turning to these groups of advisors to help formulate the ideas of this New Deal. These social workers were part of that progressive movement that we've been talking about, and they speak with different voices. They don't have a unified opinion on things. Just like we saw before, the progressive movement wasn't a unified movement. It was branched out into all different kinds of subjects. The intellectuals that Roosevelt turned to were professors at Columbia University, and they advised Roosevelt that the day of free market competition was a thing of the past, and that the government needed to regulate big firms and corporations, manage and direct them. And this really became the thinking of the first New Deal. So FDR assumes office on March 1st, and then on March 5th, he declares a bank holiday. Now, why exactly does the new president do this? Well, you have to remember what the banking system was like when we talked about it in Part 1. The banking system is on the verge of collapsing in the United States. Banks had really invested in the stock market and in bonds, and they were pretty much wiped out. And those funds that they invested into the stocks and bonds were their depositors' money that they were depositing into the bank. Also keep in mind, depositors themselves were getting worried about the state of the economy, and they were going and pulling those funds out of the bank, and these banks were being wiped out. So FDR is looking at a way of trying to save the banks. So what happens is he's pushing through a lot of legislation at this time, and we'll go in detail more about some of this legislation. But the first was the Glass-Steagall Act. And what was it meant to do? What was it meant to stop? Well, it was trying to stop all those practices with the banks that had been one of the causes of the financial crash of Wall Street. So banks were barred from buying and selling stock. So again, they weren't going to be playing with people's money, the depositors. And sadly, this actually was repealed in the 1990s under Bill Clinton. So now banks are free to do it once again. Let's hope they don't get us into any more financial crises, right? What we also see is from the Glass-Steagall Act comes the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC. Whenever you go to the bank, you'll see it actually stuck right there on the window by the front door. Now, what does this mean? Well, basically, the government ensures that whatever you have up in, or actually deposited in your account, before it was up to $100,000, should the bank gets into financial difficulties, the federal government ensures that you will get your money back. And now it's moved up to $250,000, so that is assured. Anything over that, you're on your own, unfortunately. One of the things that FDR also does is take the U.S. off the gold standard. Now, if you remember when we talked about chapter, I believe it was 9, about money and precious metal species, what really backs up money? Well, today, we are no longer on the gold standard. No nation in the world is on the gold standard anymore. And it partly comes from the lessons that we learned during the Great Depression. If you remember when we talked about in chapter 9 that you had to have gold or silver to back up the money. And that's great to a certain extent, that if you have enough gold and silver to back up your money, you have money that has real value. However, when we get into times like depressions, being on that kind of gold standard is also kind of a, a situation you don't really want to be in, because to actually print out more money, that means you're going to actually have to buy more gold, and gold is expensive. So by taking us off the gold standard, the government is allowed to print out more money as an economy needs it, or pull back in printing out more money, again, to stimulate the economy. And this is called fiat money, and it comes from the Latin meaning to let be. So again, we learned this lesson from the Great Depression, and like I said, no nation on the earth today is part of the gold standard. And it's because of these lessons that we learned that these nations no longer participate in the gold standard. So by 1936, not a single bank really fails in the United States because of these measures. If we look back to the years 1929 to 1933, almost 5,000 banks were failing in the United States. That's 1/3 of the nation's banks. But again, by 1936, with these measures, not a single bank fails in the United States. All right, so let's talk about the first 100 days and something known as the alphabet agencies. If you become president, the first 100 days, or first 3 months really of your term, is a day that you can get through the most legislation through Congress before everything locks up. And FDR really takes advantage of the momentum of this time and pushes through a flurry of legislation. And what we see is never before has an American president exercised so much power, and never before has one so dramatically increased the role of government in ordinary people's lives. So through this, one of the things that we get is the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. And basically what this was it was a program to set young men to work, and they would be doing things such as forest preservation, flood control, improving national parks, and they were paid about $30 per month. And by the time this program ends by 1942, it's employed about 3 million men. So another part of the alphabet agencies was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA or the AAA. Basically, what this was designed for was to raise farm prices by setting quotas on crops. So farmers are actually being paid not to grow crops or to raise certain animals. So those who were growing certain crops, they just left them in the fields to be destroyed. And one dramatic example of this is in 1933, after this is actually set up. Almost 6 million pigs, believe it or not, during this time of famine were actually slaughtered. So again, the government is doing this in the hopes of trying to raise farm prices. There is the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NRA, and what this sets to do is set standards and codes for the output and prices and working conditions. So again, what we see is the day of cutthroat competition is pretty much ended, or it's believed to be ended by these new dealers. Also, what we get out of this is the Public Works Administration, the PWA, and what this really is the government injecting about $3.3 billion into the economy by partnering with private construction companies and going out and building roads, schools, swimming pools, other public facilities. So again, the government is getting involved within the economy. And if you remember before, the traditional ways of thinking was that the government should stay out of the economy. What we're seeing before the New Deal, the question was whether the government should be involved in the economy. And now after the New Deal, the question will be is how should the government interfere into the economy? Another thing is the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TUWA, is actually set up in Tennessee, and what they do is they actually go in and build dams, and they're providing hydroelectric power in Tennessee, and the government is now actually competing with private companies in the selling of electricity. So, with Roosevelt setting up these New Deal policies, of course he's going to have critics, as all presidents do, and they come from both members of his party and then outside of his party, the Republicans. A lot of conservatives are looking at FDR, and they're saying that he's being too much like a dictator. He's pushing too much legislation, that he has too much power, and basically that he's creating the welfare state. And the welfare state, if you're asking yourself what is that, and many of you haven't even had political science yet, it's a system of income assistance, health care, and social services that are being provided by the state. Before, again, the United States didn't do this. And also what we see is FDR is facing a lot of criticism for people in his own party who are on the extreme left. And what they're saying is, again, he's not going far enough. We're going to actually talk about two in just a moment, Father Charles Conklin, and we'll talk about Huey Long in just a moment. What we're seeing is one of his critics is a guy named Dr. Francis Townsend, who's out of California. And what he's saying is FDR, again, isn't doing enough, and basically older people, should actually receive a check for $200 each month on the condition that they go out and actually spend the money to energize the economy. And he had a large following of about 2 million people. When I was just now talking about the criticisms, I actually wanted to show these two pictures of these two important critics of FDR at the time. One is actually Father James Conklin, known as the radio priest, and the other is Huey P. Long. Father James Conklin, the radio priest, had a weekly program that was broadcast throughout the nation. He had about 30 million listeners, and people loved to hear Father Conklin attack bankers, big businessmen, and capitalists. And what Father Conklin was calling for was basically the government to go out and control certain key industries to keep the economy going. And in the beginning, Conklin is a supporter of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. However, he soon becomes disenchanted with the New Deal, seeing that it's not going far enough, that it's not really taking care of the needs of social justice. And what he also sees is FDR as being, in a sense, too cozy with bankers. So he becomes totally disillusioned with it. Also, Father Conklin, in his radio addresses, also hints to this kind of Jewish conspiracy with these bankers. It becomes highly anti-Semitic. And eventually, he starts to put in ideas that he's very favorable to the idea of European fascism. So much so that eventually, by World War II, he's pretty much kicked off the airwaves. Another critic of FDR is Huey P. Long, the Kingfish. He's one of the most kind of colorful characters in U.S. history. And what his rise really shows within the U.S. is the dissatisfaction of many with the slow economic progress of the New Deal. So who is this Huey P. Long, the Kingfish? Huey P. Long really reflects the kind of progressive and socialist tendencies within the state of Louisiana. He becomes governor in 1928, and he pretty much rules the government of the state of Louisiana with an iron fist. He, in a sense, becomes the dictator of Louisiana. And he's actually used as a figure of inspiration for Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men. Basically, as I said, Huey P. Long is ruling Louisiana like a dictator. He's heavily taxing the oil industry in the state, and through this he's building roads, schools, stadiums, other public buildings, and he's very popular with the lower social classes within the state itself. By 1930, Huey P. Long will become the United States Senator from Louisiana. By 1934, Huey P. Long is ready to take his policies nationwide, and he comes up with something called Share Our Wealth, in which he declares every man to be a king. Now, how is this policy going to work? Well, according to Long, the wealth of the most richest people in the United States would be confiscated, and the average American would be given a check of $5,000 and guaranteed a job. So Long himself actually claims a following of about 5 million voters, and it looks like Huey P. Long will be a contestant in challenging FDR for the presidency. However, in 1935, he's mysteriously assassinated just as he's on the point of actually going all out in his national program. So now let's discuss the second New Deal. It's obvious that the first efforts of this New Deal, this program, it's not really pulling the country out of trouble. If we want to be honest, economically, Roosevelt's going to be no more successful than what Herbert Hoover is. The thing about FDR is he actually inspires the nation with hope that prosperity is just around the corner, that we're going to get out of this. And he radiates this energy and charisma that really inspires a lot of people. And we'll talk about that more when we discuss his fireside chats. So FDR now decides to launch the second New Deal. Where the first New Deal really focused on economic recovery, this New Deal is on economic security. So for FDR, it's really the responsibility of the government to protect against unemployment and poverty. And so what we see is we stop business recovery, and what we start doing is redistributing national income. So it kind of sounds a little like that FDR is kind of taking some of his criticisms and putting to use in this New Deal. What we see is, with the redistributing of national incomes, we're enhancing the power to purchase goods in this new consumer economy. If you remember, like we talked about in the first part of Chapter 22, the economy of the United States is based on consumer spending. So again, the idea is to give people money, go out, buy things, stimulate the economy. Also, what we see is there's also going to be a larger tax on larger fortunes and company profits. One of the things that really comes out of the New Deal is something known as the Rural Electrification Agency, the REA. And this is actually a very successful program out of the second part of the New Deal, so much so that by the year 1950, 90% of the nation's farms had been wired for electricity. So with this, there are other programs that come out with this second New Deal. One of the ones that is kind of made famous is the WPA, and this stands for the Works Progress Administration. With this, about 3 million people are hired in its first year, and it's not confined to any kind of social class within the United States. They take blue-collar workers, white-collar workers, professionals, you name it. They're being employed with the WPA. Musicians, artists, actors, writers are even employed. And what we see is, with this, the government becomes the nation's biggest employer. With the WPA, with trying to get everyone to work and taking everyone that we can, we get about 650,000 miles of road built. There's over 125,000 public buildings built, 8,000 parks. And in your community, if you actually go out and kind of look at the sidewalks or stadiums that were built around this time, chances are it was actually made by the WPA. Again, getting people to work. And the most famous WPA projects were actually in the arts, employing artists to go out and draw murals, paint pictures, have writers write things, actors to perform things. And here, as you see in this picture, I know my video was kind of blocking it, but here we have these men actually going out and making these sidewalks, and what you see in the right-hand corner is an artist actually going out and sketching them doing this. So again, the thing is to get everyone to work. I mentioned that, a lot of these public works, you can probably find these in your local community. What you can actually do to actually kind of verify this is usually there's a little stamp placed somewhere on all these projects. And here on the right it says, built by Works Progress Administration 35 through 38. So again, this is part of that second New Deal, trying to get people back to work and in turn get the economy moving again. What we see out of this is also the Wagner Act. And what this really does is it's kind of, how can I put it, labor's Magna Carta. What this really is bringing more democracy into the workplace. And the guy that actually sponsored this is actually the senator from New York, Robert Wagner. And he says basically this, that the workers' ability to pool their strength in collective bargaining represents the next step in the evolution of American freedom. So what we see is government is now becoming the middleman between the large corporation and the workers. And they're guaranteeing unionization with higher wages. So with this is going to aid in economic growth, stimulate the economy. Again, we're not trying to get rid of the unions. We're now kind of doing a backflip in a sense. We're for the unions, and again, the government is going to guarantee fair practices, and they're going to act as the middleman. So things before, when we talked about unions trying to start in factories and troublemakers and big businessmen and firing them and blacklisting them, this has now been made illegal. Big business can't fire union leaders, and they can't blacklist these men to where they're locked out of the industries completely. What we see now is the kind of the centerpiece of the Second New Deal, and a lot of you got this right with the quiz. Basically, this is the Social Security Act of 1935, and Roosevelt really believes that the national government has a responsibility to ensure the material well-being of ordinary citizens. And so with this National Security Act, what it does is it creates an unemployment insurance, old age pensions, aid to the disabled, and families with dependent children. And so this really wasn't a new idea. Progressives had actually been pushing for this since 1912, and Europe, they had already had these systems in place for decades. So again, this wasn't a new idea. And so what we see is the the U.S. government would give a permanent system of social insurance. So again, these are not new ideas. This is really the American version of the welfare state, and a lot of critics hammered Roosevelt on this. And again, the welfare state is providing those social services, health care, income guarantees. So this, if you ever hear the term welfare state, this is what we're talking about. What we also see is this really shows the extent of the New Deal and also its limits. Originally, health care itself was supposed to be part of this New Deal program. However, it was dropped when the American Medical Association disapproved of it. They were afraid that somehow the government was going to get involved in doctors' activities and how much income they were going to make. So this was dropped like a hot potato. So this is the Social Security Act. And the system itself, so we have it in place, and now the debate is, how are you going to fund Social Security? And you hear Social Security in the news all the time, that it's about to go broke. How is this thing funded? And with jobs, you kind of have a sense of how it's funded. Basically, it comes down to this. Originally, there were some New Dealers who wanted the government to flip the bill for the entire thing. Others were more in favor of state and local governments providing the funds for this. Roosevelt himself sees that maybe that it needs to be funds taken from taxes on employers and employees themselves. And what we get is a hybrid of the national, state, and local funding to control and set standards. So again, old age pensions are paid on taxes on employers and employees. And this is also going to pay unemployment. And given what's going on in the United States right now, millions are really out of work, and a lot of people are applying for unemployment benefits. This is where this comes from. So again, the states are going to pay most of the cost of the direct poor relief. And what we see is this Social Security Act really represents this kind of radical departure from the traditional function of government. Again, the government in previous thinking didn't get involved in these kind of social issues. And now the government is jumping in full feet into it. So this is really a responsibility that the government itself hasn't let go yet, and has been with us ever since. Excuse me. What we see is, not only is FDR a master politician, he's also a master political communicator. At a time when his opponents really control all the newspapers in America, FDR gets his message directly to people by going on the airwaves. He's in people's homes. And at a time when 2/3 of Americans own radios, Roosevelt, he almost becomes like a member of the family. People listen in, they can't get enough of him. And this kind of also contributes to the great sadness of when he passes away in 1944. Like I said, his fireside chats, his national addresses become favorite listening for millions of people. And how he really sets the tone for it isn't by saying my fellow Americans, he says my friends. So again, he's endearing himself to his listeners. And he had a nice kind of soft way of speaking and kind of taking a dull political speech and really livening it up. And what we see through these fireside chats is FDR really gives liberalism its new meaning that we know today. And well, you're probably thinking right now, well, what was liberalism's thinking before? Basically, liberalism, if we look at it in the 19th century, meant a limited government and a free market economy. Roosevelt is really the one that's responsible for changing this. Basically, what we see is it's going to be a very active state involved with social issues and promoting a big, more, how can I put it, a larger role for government than previously before. So what we see is Roosevelt is constantly linking the idea of freedom with this economic security. A lot of his opponents, again, are saying that Roosevelt has too much power, that this program, the New Deal, is undermining the fiscal responsibility of the nation, that the rights of all are being kind of chunked into the garbage can to support poor people. And so, again, these opponents form this American Liberty League, and this Liberty League is kind of almost a hate Roosevelt, hate the New Deal kind of club. And so Roosevelt, again, has his supporters, he has his enemies. But again, Roosevelt takes his ideas directly to the American people by getting on the airwaves. Here's Roosevelt right here. Again, my picture kind of obstructs it, but there he is making one of his fireside chats within the White House. And you see all the microphones arrayed before him, NBC and maybe CBS right there, major kind of news outlets at the time, still today. And as you see on the right, people are tuning in and listening in to hear what the president has to say. How is he going to get us out of this? How is this second New Deal going to affect us? And again, he speaks to them in a friendly, common language, my friends, endearing them to him, so much so that he becomes almost like a family member, like I said. FDR is so popular, by the time we get into the next election for the president in 1936, FDR, oh my God, he gets about 61% of the total vote. So FDR walks away with this feeling pretty good, pretty psyched up, thinking that he can't make any mistakes. And that's a dangerous thing to think. It's called hubris, ladies and gentlemen. And what we see is FDR's political sense is about to leave him. Where we really see this is the decline of the New Deal and Roosevelt's trying to pack the Supreme Court. This is where he makes his first big blunder. The Supreme Court itself was really staffed with a bunch of judges whose thinking was back from the 19th century. Many of these guys were old men, almost past the age of 70. And what we saw was they're beginning to strike down a lot of parts of the New Deal, calling it unconstitutional. Two parts of it that had already been struck down by these judges were the NRA and the AAA. And what we see is Roosevelt lets it leak that he's planning on actually increasing the number of justices on the Supreme Court, getting new judges on it who will back the new idea. And when this actually comes out, FDR's supporters and his critics kind of joined together in denouncing Roosevelt for doing this, saying that this was pretty much just a power grab by Roosevelt for power itself. And what we see is after this, Roosevelt's administration starts to lose steam, and it really won't pick up that steam again in popularity until the start of World War II. So after this, the Supreme Court, how can I put it, kind of gets the message from Roosevelt, and they start to show their willingness to go along with FDR. But as I said before, his popularity has taken a big beating on this. So, like I said, the New Deal is starting to slow down. By 1937, the United States Housing Act is passed, and with this comes the Fair Labor Standard Bill, and it takes a year to pass in 1938. Basically, I'm just kind of going through these small parts of the Second New Deal. They're not really important, but still I want to cover them. And what this Fair Labor Standards does is basically it bans all goods produced by children, and what it sets up is something known as a minimum wage. It's 40 cents now, and today I think it's $7 and something. So again, this is where the minimum wage for us comes from. Any hours that you work overtime past 40 hours, you're going to have to be paid. So again, employers can't get out of weaseling out of giving you your money. What we see is, by 1937, we see another downturn in the economy. In 1936, the economic conditions looked like they were starting to improve, but like I said, by 37, things are going into the tank once again. FDR himself cuts farm subsidies and the WPA work relief. And with this, what we see is the results are disastrous. Businesses are starting to fail once again. Businesses are no longer producing the goods that they were once before. Our stock market, again, tanks. And unemployment goes from 14 to 20% in America. What actually happens in this time is a guy named John Maynard Keynes, this British economist, actually publishes a book in which he kind of destroys the idea of governments having balanced budgets. And what John Maynard Keynes says is, when we get into financial difficulties like this, the government should spend as much money as possible to stimulate the economy. And if it means that the government runs into a deficit, so be it. And you're probably asking yourself, well, what does a deficit mean? It means that the government is spending more money than it's taking in. Again, according to John Maynard Keynes, this is fine. And this becomes known, if you study economics, or if you've had it yet or not, I don't know, but this is known as Keynesian economics. So FDR actually applies these ideas of John Maynard Keynes, and what we see is the crisis begins to pass. So now let's talk about the end of the New Deal. What we see is the New Deal is slowly starting to die off. If we look at the first New Deal between 33 and 34, it was all about economic planning, right? By 35 and 36, we're talking about economic distribution. So now, public spending would be the government's new weapon, Keynesian economics. What we see is FDR is now saying those who are actually in government who have elected offices, he's actually going to campaign against those people if they don't back the New Deal. And what we see is this is another kind of misstep by Roosevelt, because the plan backfires, and what happens is FDR loses his majority in Congress. With this, FDR now is becoming more focused on the international events going on in Europe, with the rise of Hitler, also what's going on in Asia with Japan invading China and other areas. And so his interest in the New Deal is starting to just slowly fall off. By the end of 1939, the New Deal is pretty much dead, ladies and gentlemen. So the question is, did the New Deal actually get the United States out of the Great Depression? And the answer is, sadly, no, it didn't. It actually would take putting the U.S. on a war footing to pull us out of the Great Depression. So again, that's another myth of the Great Depression, that the New Deal ended the Great Depression. It didn't. It wasn't until we get involved with World War II, and again, we get into a war economy, that we were able to pull ourselves out of this Great Depression. All right, guys, that's the end of it for me. Tune in next time, I guess you could say, and I'll put up the lecture for World War II. If you have any questions for me, again, feel free to email me anytime that you want. Let me know what you think about these little class lectures that I'm videotaping. Again, guys, thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time.